Hey everybody, Brendan here. Welcome to a new video. Today we are going to be covering my third ever tournament. And this tournament had 4 games. If you are interested in one of the specific 4 games and the lessons learned from each game, you can go to the timestamps in the description to skip ahead as you please. And let's jump into it. So this is now my second tournament. I have now had one full tournament where I completed every single round that was available in it. Whereas the first tournament I did, I only played 2 out of the 5 rounds. I played I believe it was the last 2 rounds of that tournament. And of course, that doesn't count as a full tournament, but that was a weekly thing, so it wasn't so bad to miss all of them. Anyways, moving forward. So we are going to be looking at game number 1, and I thought we would just look at the entire game here. It's a bit shorter, but it's also very important because it does highlight some important things within it. So we see the move e4, c5, and we are just going to go through the first few moves. So this is just standard development. This is a Sicilian defense. It's a bit of an odd way to get to one because you see this knight to f6 move instead of the normal d6 or e6 here. But knight f6 is playable because after e5 you can just play knight d5, for example. But okay, knight c6, d4, e6, and this does somewhat just transpose into a kind of a weird timing off. The thing is, here e6 is a little less natural. I think it is because of bishop e3, but the whole point is you should really just take here, and after takes just continue development with something like d6 or e6. Maybe e6 isn't even good anymore, but that's not really the focus on this. But I just wanted to bring it up as something else that can be shown from it. Knight b3, again, everything is somewhat fine here, and then this move b6. Now, b6 isn't really a move you play in the Sicilian, at least yet. You can play them in what's called a hedgehog position, but that's not really something too important for what's happening here. You probably wouldn't play b6 until move 20 to 30, especially before your king is castled, and we're going to see why. Now, the problem is d6 and b6 were played, and we can see that this knight here is now undefended. Now, I'm not specifically going to talk about undefended pieces, though this does play a role. It's actually about the power of the pin. Now, the first move I play here is bishop e5, and this immediately puts pressure on the pin. And after bishop to b7, I want to try to increase the pressure. And the way to do that is by playing the move knight to d5. And the interesting thing is, it doesn't seem like this really increases pressure of any sort. The thing is, there are some threats here. There's an idea of knight b4 in the position, putting more pressure on the piece, and maybe even taking or playing bishop g5 and trying to ruin the pawn structure. Also, if you try to avoid any issues of the pin and play something like knight bd7, you're just wasting time. And the whole point of playing knight d5 is it's very direct, and it's not really easy to deal with it in a comfortable way. Again, knight takes d5, which is desirable because you don't really want a knight to stay on d5. It just loses a piece after d takes or e takes on d5. If a6, you just take with the bishop, and that's fine too, because you still win a piece at the end. So a6 was actually played after knight d5, but there's a bit of a problem with this move, and it weakens more squares. So not only was the pin an issue, but it caused the weakness of the b6 square, and now we can see again why b6 is such a problematic move, as now b6 can be just taken, and things are just falling apart now, unfortunately. After queen to d7, I could play knight c7 immediately, but I thought I'd play it a bit more conservatively with the move bishop to a4, and I just want to keep the power of the pin going. There's always ideas of knight c7 still, so they can play a move like rook c8, but it doesn't really do them too much good here. Again, the move knight d5 fails because the knight can't move because it's pinned to the queen, for example. So yeah, black is unfortunately just completely tangled up, and there's no good way to get out of it. So after bishop to a4, my opponent played h5 and allowed knight c7. Again, I think maybe their best chance was something like rook c8, though this doesn't really spell too much hope, as you could possibly just jump in anyways. You could also reply with a move like knight b4. I honestly just like the idea of castling, kingside or queenside. Honestly, shouldn't make too much of a difference. I'd say kingside's safer because not only are we up a pawn, but we still have this ridiculous lead in development, and it's not so easy to make any improvements. Not only that, but you could really just take on f6 and play something like g4, and I would just say white is just winning in this position. I wouldn't say that's too ridiculous. Just because, like, where's black's king going? Is it staying in the center? If it is, then it's just weak. There's ideas of even just a really slow maneuver of knight d2, c4, e3, d5. And if you can genuinely think of plans like that, then there's just no hope. And even though white's king may not go on the king side anymore for castling, it doesn't really matter because white's king isn't the one being attacked. So regardless, after h5, I went and won the exchange. I'm up 3 points of material, but I'll just show the next few moves, including knight to a5, just putting more pressure on the pin. And this they just kind of broke under pressure, as I was just going to take a6 and then either go queen c4 or just take the bishop. So yeah, this is just a hopeless game. And after knight takes a5, I won the queen, and the game ended shortly thereafter. Now, let's go on to game number 2. Okay, so now we are in game number 2, and there's two things I would like to mention. They both involve trades. The first one isn't as important as the last one. The last one is much, much more important in so many ways, but this, I guess, should also be mentioned because it has to do with trades, and this is close enough of a topic. The move bishop to g4. This is technically fine. The thing is, playing moves like bishop g4 and with the idea of eventually taking, especially after e6, you kind of have to take from h3. The thing is, the trade doesn't really benefit me in any way. In fact, it hurts my position a bit because right now I do have the bishop pair. Things can open up quite easily with taking on d4 at some point. Not right now when the bishop's on g4, which is why it's actually somewhat misplaced here. But you can take on d4, play a move like knight c6, and things can actually open up quite easily. And then you just have the bishop pair. Bishops are usually favored in open positions because of their ability from move to one side of the board to the other in just one move, whereas the knights can take, let's just say a knight is on b8 and it wants to go to the 8th rank. It takes 1, 2, 3, 4 moves. You have to make a little awkward, inefficient move to get to that side of the board. And that's the fastest way you can get there. So it's all about thinking of things like that and putting things in perspective. So, of course, again, there are advantages with the knight. For example, color complexes. You can have a good knight versus bad bishop or vice versa. But that's not really the focus here. The focus is the trade. And the trade here didn't really benefit me. In fact, it made my opponent's position pretty much fine. I played queen c7. There was a threat of taking on b7 here, so I was a bit worried of that. Knight b5, which kind of shows that I should have instead played the move queen c7 with the idea of maybe knight c6, as now knight b5 doesn't come with tempo. So queen c7, knight b5, queen e7, and here is where I make a bit of a mistake, actually quite a big one. Knight takes d6 is what my opponent played, and I misevaluated this move, and I misunderstood what the consequences of taking it versus non-taking it were. Now, when I saw this, I was thinking, okay, I lost one, maybe I'm going to lose 2 pawns, especially if I play a move like knight c6, they can take on c5. What I failed to understand about this position or about material in general is even if I lose a pawn or 1 point of material, uh, different pieces of material mean different things. For example, you can be down a pawn and have the two bishops versus two knights and still be considered even or even better. And this is because, again, of the bishop's ability to travel from one side of the board to the other, making them very good in open positions. It's all about looking at these specifics. And the thing is, here, you don't even have to worry specifically about the specifics. The issue is, if you do not take on d6, which is, taking on d6 is the best move. I played the move knight c6, which I do consider to be a blunder. If I do take on d6, I do lose the rook in the corner. However, it is important to note that, say after a move like knight to d7, for example, if they were to take on a immediately, which maybe or maybe not be the best exact way to get to this position, but essentially white will get a rook for two pieces. What's the evaluation here? So white is up a pawn, but the truth is this position isn't so great for white. And the reason why is because the two pieces here are actually just better than the rook. And that's what you need to look at when you look at material imbalances. Okay, well, rook and a pawn. So if you count an extra pawn, you'd probably count this f4 pawn or this d4 pawn. There's a lot of issues in white's position, and there's so many pawns on the board for both sides that being down a pawn here doesn't actually matter too much, because the position and the initiative should favor black in most circumstances. So again, you need to make sure that when you evaluate what's happening, that you're still giving yourself the optimal position. Especially if you receive a confusing move from your opponent. This knight takes d6 really surprised me. Again, I thought I was either losing an exchange. I can't quite recall whether it was I thought I was losing an exchange, or I thought I was just losing the rook and I just got tunnel visioned over it. But understanding the evaluations of these positions is very important. And if your opponents don't understand that two pieces is not as valuable as a rook, then they can land themselves in trouble versus you, as those are two fundamentally different points of view. So do remember, in general cases, that two pieces is better than a rook, even if you have a pawn or two in return. Now let's go on to game number 3. Okay, now we lost our second game, we won our first, and we're 1 out of 2 in this tournament. Now, recovering from a win, I do have a pretty good position here. I do have the bishop pair, and it's not so easy to make progress or any improvements for white. For example, you could play a move like c5 and go for the e5 pawn, though this doesn't really look like it's anything too worthwhile, especially after a move like queen b6. It just opens the position up more. These types of pawn trades usually will favor bishops in general, and you don't really want to allow that, especially if you're trying to get an advantage or kind of improve your position, I guess, as white. This just kind of makes it worse, unfortunately. So instead, my opponent did play the move queen to d2. It is, again, pretty difficult. You'd want to play the move d4, and it's very understandable why. It falls under the same principle of it just improving the position for black. For example, after takes, you can take with the knight. There's ideas even of just playing this tricky move bishop g4, and the whole point of it is really just to play queen h5 and try to weaken some squares while you're at it, as unfortunately you don't have time to take on g4 because of queen h2. You could play it like a different way, like bishop to even c8. The whole point is if bishop d7, you don't really want to fall victim to any e5 and like knight c6. There's none of that in the air anyways, but it's just being cautious, of course. Anyways, yeah, so this d4, there's so many lines that already just appear better for black, and this is just at like a very surface level point of view. And this isn't really specifically what I wanted to talk about. It was more so that the starting position is quite good for me. It's hard to play d4, and if you don't play d4, you just have this backwards d3 pawn. So here I had a few options. I could have gone with a quiet move. Rook A or F to D8 are both very, very respectable. And so is the move Queen F6, which I actually prefer. But there's also two other moves. The first move is F5. So going back on the premise of me wanting to make trades, this isn't really such a great move. Either after takes, if I take with the bishop, this is especially not so great because they just go for the bishop pair. They get rid of my bishop pair and just put a knight on e4. And this knight's actually pretty well placed. It's not really easy to move it at all. And all of a sudden I went from having the bishop pair and a definitely dominant position to something that's pretty unclear. Sure, they have this weakness on d3, but what's my bishop doing on d6? There's no real way to open it up, and it's just much worse than the potential we had before. So this f5, even if after takes with the queen, this doesn't really look too promising after a move like knight e4, because we're giving up this important e4 square. Whereas again, if we look at it from here, this e4 square is really limiting this this knight, or this e4 pawn is limiting this knight quite a bit. So we want to keep it like that. So I played the move b5, and this was pretty interesting. I think it's a bit dubious because of the move we'll see. Rather, again, queen f6 does actually cover the problem. So if you guys can actually find the issue after b5, then full marks to you. Hopefully you do see it, but there is a threat here, right? So if our opponent, for example, plays a move like queen e2, we can maybe even just take on c4. I think that should even be fine. There's also just queen f6 defending the e5 pawn. Maybe that'll be important later. And yeah, black is still just much better. But after the move b5, there's a problem. And that's the move c5. And all of a sudden, it's not so clear as it was before. Where after takes on c5, knight takes e5, and queen to f6, you're kind of not getting the position you'd want, especially here. There's ideas like f4 now, and it feels like white just improved their position so much that they're better instead of just equalizing. d4 is coming at some point as well. And this does solve their problems, right? Because this d4 pawn was a huge factor in limiting the d4 break because it would open the position. Now, trading the c4 pawn for the e5 pawn, that's completely different. The c4 pawn is not really doing much, whereas the e5 pawn, again, is limiting these two pawns. So definitely not a good trade. Of course, my opponent did miss this, though c5 would have offered not only counter chances, but just abilities to be better in this game. Instead, my opponent played rook a to e1 and missed two threats. Their own threat of playing c5, which is the theme of this game, and the threat of taking on c4 and winning the pawn, which was my idea. So of course I did take the pawn, and I won one, which was nice to say. And after knight h4, I played queen f6, just attacking the knight. And now, unfortunately, they either have to protect the knight or move the rook, and now they're losing more material than just the pawn. And right now it's already decisive after g3 and takes, but I'll just continue the game. It's not too much longer. Rook f d8, and my opponent misses another threat. By playing f4, what they fail to realize is after takes, they can't take back, but they miss that because after takes, this knight is undefended. So they missed another threat. And after rook to g1, they missed another threat, which was bishop c5, a discovery against the queen and also attacking the rook. If you try anything like queen g2, threatening checkmate, the unfortunate part is it was a good idea, but when you remove one of the attackers of the g7 square, all of a sudden it doesn't work. And of course, my opponent did resign after bishop to c5, rook g3, and rook takes d2. So again, make sure you understand your opponent's threats and make sure you make moves that either are in compliance with those threats to avoid them being executed, Or you understand that maybe it's actually not so much of a threat. For example, this knight takes d6 thing, if you did everything to avoid it, the game 2 move, if you did everything to avoid it, then it's not actually something you should have done like I did. I missed the idea of just taking it and allowing the threat to occur where I would actually be better in the resulting position. So again, there's a lot of ways you can miss threats or allow threats, for example, but being aware of them is the very important part and the key part of improving your play and becoming a good player in general. So watch out for that. Now let's go on to the final game of the tournament. Okay, now this is the final game. This one's pretty important because I know a lot of people that have difficulties, especially when they're starting out. They don't really know how to develop their pieces or make lasting moves that are just good and that don't make them lose out of the opening, so they can get a playable position and just not blunder. And there are some fundamental rules about the opening that I think are important to note. Control the center, not only with your pawns, but your pieces as well. Try to develop the attacking the center by attacking the center with the weakest to the strongest pieces. So you start with pawns, which are worth 1 point, as the point refers to pawn. Then knights, then bishops, then maybe rooks by castling your king and putting your rooks in the center, or your queen at that point. And controlling the center like this avoids you from being kicked around and losing time. And this is exactly what happened in this game, where my opponent, unfortunately, not only allowed themselves to be kicked around, which lost a lot of time, but most importantly, they moved several of the same piece too many times in the opening, and this resulted in them losing too much time and allowed me to take advantage of their bad coordination and their lack of development, as it's called. So after e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, we see bishop b4, bishop c5. So this is all perfect. My opponent is attacking the center. They're attacking d4, e5, d4 with the bishop as well. The e5 pawn is attacking d4. They have this a bit of a grip on d4, and their position is pretty solid. Castles. And knight d4 is where I'd say things start going wrong. So this is technically playable, actually. It's just a weird variation of the bird's defense where you develop your dark squared bishop a little early. Though there shouldn't be too much wrong with it, other than the fact that after you take, you do somewhat have to take with the e-pawn. If you were to take with the bishop, c3, and d4 comes really quickly. As you can see from this position, although it's black to move, white has 3 forces, including, if you do include castling to be these two as well, then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pieces developed, and only 1 for black. So in normal terms, this would be considered to be worth like a 2 or like maybe 1.75 pawn advantage. And when you get to that range, it's almost decisive. So this lack of development is very serious. So it's something to avoid. Though if you do take with the pawn instead, even after c3, there is still some hope to not be so far behind in development. Of course, you're still 1, 2, 3, 4 versus 2 instead of just 1. But knight d7 and castles can come pretty quickly, and black may be worse, but usually can hold on. So bishop d6, and now we see a second piece move in the opening. And not only does this move a piece again in the opening, it also undefends a pawn and loses material in the meantime. So again, they're not developing their pieces. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pieces developed, and only 1 now because they just let me win a pawn. So their position's actually getting worse in the meantime. Now a move like queen h4, trying to go for the e pawn and the h pawn at the same time, threatening checkmate, doesn't really work. There's the move e5, but also there's the move g3, which I am a bit of a fan of because it says, hey, just like game 3 or game 2, what if your threat actually does occur? Is it a threat? And here it's not, because after the move rook to e1, pinning the queen to the king, we win the queen for the rook. The queen is worth 9 points of material, and the rook is worth 5. You'd usually say this is just a completely decisive advantage, and most players would be able to win this. Now instead, c takes d4, queen to f6 instead, and unfortunately this is another factor when you aren't developing your pieces. The coordination is a lot worse, or it's a lot harder to coordinate properly, and this loses a piece. Now after e5, one of these pieces are going to be lost because this pawn is protected by another one, called a pawn fork, as you would say. So bishop takes e5, d takes e5, and queen takes e5. Looks like you get 2 pawns for the piece, but not only do you lose the bishop, in this case you lose the queen. And here we can just end the analysis of this game, as unfortunately our opponent is going to be losing the queen. So to recap the tournament, in the first game we were able to take advantage of the pins, and why this move b6 in the Sicilians is just not so great. In game 2, there was a fundamental misunderstanding of material, specifically understanding that 2 pieces are usually better than a rook, even if you're down a pawn or 2 for that. And also in game 3, we had an interesting position where we missed threats, and we also were able to achieve threats and execute them because our opponent missed those threats. So it's all about understanding what your opponent's threats are, and also in terms of game 2, understanding that even though they have specific threats, maybe they're not so bad and you should reconsider and evaluate them properly. Lastly, in the final game, we learned that making too many moves with the same pieces in an opening can cause a lack of development, which in turn can cause bad coordination between your pieces, make it more problematic to develop your pieces later on, and can usually result in the loss of material by force, which will end usually in a losing position. So hopefully you learned something from this analysis. I certainly did when I played these games, and looking back on them now, I do think these are still important themes, even at my improved level. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed this tournament analysis, and I will see you guys in the next one. Thank you for watching, and see you then.